Today we're taking a look at the Cleric subclass, Tempest domain. This might be the most versatile Cleric Baldur's Gate 3 has to offer. You can build this character to be melee, ranged, caster, that's whether it's single or multi-class, and you can even build this character to make use of the lightning charge items that you'll acquire during your playthrough. To top all that off, you can do all this while still healing and supporting your party members. So let's go ahead and dive into the build now. We're going to start with a level 1 respec on Shadowheart, and we're going to obviously take Cleric as well as the subclass Tempest domain. Tempest domain is going to give us 2 spells that are always prepared, Thunderwave as well as Fog Cloud. Now both of these are actually fairly useful, so you'll get a lot of use of these throughout the course of the game, and it's nice to just always have these prepared, allowing you to prepare other spells that you may want to have access to as well. The subclass feature, Wrath of the Storm, allows you to strike back at an attacking creature, potentially dealing 2 to 16 lightning damage. On a failed saving throw, you still deal half of that as thunder damage. Incredibly nice, and over the course of the game, this will really add up to the total damage that it deals in the course of that playthrough. So this does really add up and make a difference long term. Now for cantrips, my preferred 3 are Guidance, Resistance, and Blade Ward. Guidance is going to give you an additional 1 to 4 in ability checks, incredibly useful in dialogue. Resistance is going to give you 1 to 4 in saving throws, very useful outside of combat as well if you know that an area is trapped or anything to that effect, or you want to just have some preventative measures on your party. You can buff yourself in this regard. Blade Ward, also great for pre-buffing outside of combat. You're going to take half the damage from bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing attacks, and it lasts for 2 turns, giving you the ability to cast this and then go forward and basically take the brunt of all the hits in the opening round of combat and leaving your party behind to then come in as the combat started. Very useful there because you have access to heavy armor and a shield. So if you're going that route with your character and the way you're developing yourself, you can be very tanky in that regard and soak a lot of that opening round damage. For ability scores here, as mentioned, this subclass is just so versatile. You could really go 100 different ways with this, so make sure that you realize when you're watching this, you can certainly put the points wherever you feel is best for you and your character. This guide, I'm going to use a balanced loadout just to kind of cover the majority and the most of this subclass that I can for everybody. So in this case, I'm leaving all the stats at 10, so I don't have any negatives. This will give me solid saving throws as well as some dialogue options. And in this case, I'm going to increase strength to 11. Honestly, the biggest weakness of this subclass, in my opinion, is the mobility. So I want to be able to boost this to 12, along with wisdom to 18 at level 4 when I get the first feat, and take ability improvement. For skill proficiencies as Shadowheart, you only have 3 options. I have persuasion covered by another character, so this basically leaves me with history and medicine by default. At level 2, we'll get channel divinity charges as well as the ability to prepare our spells. Now the channel divinity charges can be used for actions like turn undead, or more importantly for this subclass, destructive wrath. When you roll thunder or lightning damage, you can use your channel divinity to deal maximum damage instead. This does enormous damage when you use this, and the more divinity charges you have, the more often you can take advantage of this. This also scales when targets are vulnerable. Making a target vulnerable is incredibly easy to do. Simply apply water, and then cast a thunder or lightning ability on them and watch for massive numbers on your screen. For prepared spells at this level, I like to take Bless. This is really strong in the early game. You get an additional 1 to 4 bonus to attack rolls at a point in the game where you likely don't have any bonuses other than just your ability scores. So this can really help you end fights sooner, making your party receive less damage and allowing you to just get through the combat much faster. Create or destroy water, as mentioned, making enemies vulnerable is a huge source of damage for this build, so we want to make sure that we have access to this. Now this is an action, so we need to use an action to apply this effect and then use an action the following turn to take advantage of that vulnerability. However, the target will remain wet. It just takes a turn to set it up basically. Healing Ward, incredibly powerful heal because it's a bonus action, so you can do something else on your turn as the main action and then follow up with a heal as well. I find Sanctuary very strong at low levels. There aren't many AoE spells early on, meaning that you can protect them essentially from all the damage that the enemies have throwing your way, and this helps keep your party members alive or key targets if they're in an encounter that has allies. Guiding Bolt is just a form of range damage here with a good range. 18 meters is a long range. It gives this class an option to do some damage if you don't want to waste something else or use a higher level spell slot as you level up. Level 3, we'll get access to level 2 spells, as well as a couple of spells that are always prepared, Shatter and Gust of Wind. Both of these are actually decent spells, so again, just some more beneficial spells that you're always going to have prepared from this subclass. What I like to do here for prepared spells, I keep Bless still, Create or Destroy Water, Healing Word, Guiding Bolt. The two new spells that I pick up are Prayer of Healing. I find this a very strong out-of-combat heal. Once you're finished with the combat, you can cast this. Does a large amount of healing, especially for this level. And on top of that, Spiritual Weapon. Very powerful summon, and it's a bonus action, meaning, again, you can take a regular action and summon a Spiritual Weapon. Summons in general are very strong in this game, especially as you progress towards the late game. Having additional targets for the enemies to hit, or just utilizing the summons to create choke points, preventing the enemies from getting to you, is very strong. At level 4, we'll gain a cantrip, another spell slot, and a feat. For the cantrip, I like to take Sacred Flame. Just gives us another option as an attack when enemies are at range, and we don't have to use all of our spell slots for casting, say, Guiding Bolt. So this is nice to have at this point. For Prepared Spell, I like to take Hold Person. At this stage of the game, there's a lot of fights with many weaker mobs and perhaps one or two enemies that are a little bit stronger. And if you're able to land a Hold Person on those stronger targets, you can really make the enemy team crumble in that regard. So this is really useful at that stage of the game, in my opinion. For feat, I like to take Ability Improvement. Now, this may be subjective depending on what you've done for your own ability scores. In this case, as the example, it allows us to round Strength and Wisdom up and get some additional benefit from those. Level 5 is pretty amazing. This is easily the strongest level that you'll have gained at this point. You can get Destroy Undead. Your turn undead will now deal additional radiant damage, which is strong in its own right, and I've certainly made many uses out of this spell to my advantage. For additional spells here that are always going to be prepared, we're going to get Call Lightning as well as Sleet Storm. Call Lightning is very powerful, especially with this build, right? We can use that Destructive Wrath to maximize this damage whenever we want. Call Lightning in general will always remain decent because you cast this once, and then for 10 more turns, you can call the Lightning again without using another spell slot. This is kind of like your go-to spell if you want to use a single spell slot charge in a fight without draining all of your resources. You know it's not a major fight, but you want to make sure you get through it without taking too much damage or suffering any real casualties. This is the go-to, okay? You cast it once, and then you can just repeat that turn after turn. Very, very strong spell. Sleet Storm is going to use a storm that disrupts the concentration of spellcasters, douses fires, and creates an ice surface. There's often encounters where the surface is all covered in fire, and we want to make sure that the targets aren't on fire. In fact, we want them to be wet so that we can take advantage of vulnerability. For prepared spells at this point, Spirit Guardians, number 1. Okay, this spell is so powerful. I would rank this among some of the best spells in the game, and it's only a level 3 spell. This puts an aura around you, and you can then just walk around mobs, weaving your way through if you aren't taking opportunity attacks or positioning yourself in such a way that the spell hits them without you being hit, and going from mob to mob every turn, just weave your way through and deal damage to these targets. It's incredibly powerful. The second spell slot I use is Mass Healing Ward, and this is just a nice overall heal for picking your party up to some degree. It has an 18-meter range, which is really my favorite part of this. It's just the ability to basically hit everybody in your party all the times, including a couple of allies or summons if you have them out. At level 6, we'll get another subclass feature, Thunderbolt Strike. When you deal lightning or thunder damage to a creature that is large or smaller, you can also push it up to 3 meters. Very nice, and if you're using this with something like Call Lightning, you can actually position the Call Lightning in such a way that it'll hit an enemy next to you without hitting yourself, and it will still push them back. For prepared spells, I like to take Glyph of Warding at this point, just to have some diversity in the type of damage I'm capable of dealing. Now, although Spirit Guardians does radiant or necrotic damage, this is an aura that you put around yourself, so sometimes the enemies will be out of range, and if I need to finish an enemy off, I like to have that option of Glyph of Warding. Just gives you a more reliable source of damage in my opinion, but there are some other good options here you could take from the other spells as well. Level 7, we'll get a couple of more always prepared spells, and these are both useful. Ice Storm is a very large AoE, and it can do some good damage on top of that. Added effect to this is when enemies try to walk through it, they can also slip and become prone, allowing you to just continue nuking them before they get to you. Freedom of movement, very powerful. This will snap an ally out of any stun. On top of that, difficult terrain can't slow them down, and they can't be magically paralyzed or restrained, and it lasts until long rest. So very, very strong spell. Essentially, you can use this to bring somebody out of a stun and then give them a buff for the remainder of the day. Or if you know there's an encounter where there's a lot of difficult terrain, you can pre-buff them with this as well. Prepared spells at this point, I like to pick up Guardian of Faith, and this is going to call a Divine Guardian that attacks nearby enemies. This basically does 20 damage to the target, and every time it does that, it takes 20 damage itself. Very strong overall, incredibly good for placing into a choke point and just watching it essentially slash everything down. Level 8, we'll gain a new action as well as a feat. Now the action is called Divine Strike Tempest, and once per turn you can deal an additional 1 to 8 thunder damage in addition to the weapon's normal damage when you make a melee attack. You'll also get this as a range version, which allows you to build again either as a melee or range character. If you're building as a caster character, you won't get full advantage of these. You'll very rarely hit with those attacks at this point in the game unless you're kind of specialized with them. But in general, these are very nice if you're playing a melee or a ranged character. Just keep in mind this works with the other subclass features you have, so these will also knock the targets back at this point. For prepared spells, I like to pick up Banishment at this point. Temporarily banish your target to another plane of existence. Crowd control in general is strong, and this allows you to take a key target and just remove it from the battlefield for a couple of turns. For the feat ability improvement again at this point, and this is just to push our wisdom up to 20, and that'll really round out the stats and allow our spells to be more effective. At level 9, we'll get 2 more always prepared spells, along with access to level 5 spells. Here we get Destructive Wave, a shockwave of either Divine or Malevolent Thunder that damages nearby creatures and possibly knocks them prone. Very powerful spell, and again, this subclass just gets access to so many good spells that are always prepared. Insect Plague, Locusts attack everyone within range, make the area difficult terrain, and impose disadvantage on perception checks. This is nice as a zoning tool. It's typically where I will use that myself. And for prepared spells, I like to pick up Flame Strike, just an option of something that isn't thunder or lightning damage in the form of fire and radiant here, as well as Mass Cure Wounds. Again, just having the 18 meter range and the ability to use this is very nice. This does cost an action, and it's very rare that I take a healing spell that uses an action. I find that the game is beatable without that, or you can either use inventory items or healing outside of combat for the most part, as long as you're playing things strategically. But I do like this spell just because of the enormous amount of healing that it can do to so many targets. At level 10, we'll gain another cantrip as well as another spell slot. For the cantrip, it really doesn't have much influence of whatever you take here. Use whichever one you feel is the best option remaining. For prepared spells, personally, I'm using Daylight at the moment. This does have some use as you get further into the story, so I'm using that at the moment. But there's a lot of good options of things that you've passed up for the time being. You could even go back and take a lower level spell. You won't have a tremendous amount of spell slots for the higher level spells, so you could certainly go back, and like I said, something like Animate Dead is actually decent. And again, just having additional summons is beneficial for your survivability in the battlefield. At level 11, we'll get access to level 6 spells, and what I like to take here is Planar Ally, just furthering the fact that summons are just very beneficial to have out on the battlefield for you. In the second slot, I use Harm. I like Harm because even on save, it will still do half the damage, and just having guaranteed sources of damage in this game are very effective. There's not a tremendous amount of them, so anytime you can get it, and especially at a level 6 spell, which is going to do considerable damage even on a save, is very nice to have. Finally, at level 12, we'll get an extra spell slot as well as a feat, and for the extra slot here, I take Hero's Feast. You and everyone around you can't be poisoned, diseased, or frightened. Your hit points increase, and you make wisdom saves with advantage. Most importantly, this lasts until a long rest, incredibly powerful. For feat, I'm choosing Alert here. One of the biggest drawbacks, at least of the setup that I have with the stat allocation, is the initiative isn't as high as I would like. So I take Alert here just for the bonus to initiative. On top of that, you can't be surprised, which is always nice as well. Now, when we're talking about endgame equipment, especially at level 12, you're going to have access to a lot of options. However, keep in mind that your equipment may vary dramatically based on what you focus this character on, whether it's melee, range, caster, and so forth. I'll show you what I'm using, and this is primarily a caster build that I actually typically use the bow as a backup. I very rarely melee. So what we have here is a helm, and this helm is going to prevent us from being critically hit. On top of that, we're going to get some resistance to fire damage. The cloak is going to allow us to do some rhetorical damage to anything that hits us, and with heavy armor and a shield, we certainly don't mind being in the front lines. The chest piece provides 19 armor class, as well as reducing incoming damage by 2, just a very good mitigation piece overall. The gloves, these are easily my worst piece. The wearer gains advantage on melee attack rolls while surrounded by 2 or more foes. I really don't have a better option here, unfortunately. What this allows me to do is, again, be in the midst of things. Rather than suffering multiple opportunity attacks, I have the ability to kind of potentially attack with my melee weapon if I get into that situation and I want to save spell slots and so forth. The boots can't be enwebbed, entangled, or ensnared, and can't slip on grease or ice. On top of that, it provides Misty Step, which is just great because, again, if I get into a situation where I want to get out, rather than suffering multiple opportunity attacks, I can just Misty Step out from this. For the main hand, this is being used to gain advantage on wisdom saving throws and perception checks, as well as providing dark vision and the Moonbeam. Moonbeam is actually very useful for this. It just gives me an additional spell, so to speak, to have at my disposal. On top of that, like I said, there's not a strong emphasis on melee with this build, so the weapon enchantment as well is pretty beneficial to have if I have to get into that situation. The amulet is just for spell slot restoration, just allows me to have some more longevity before resting. Ring of Salving, this is just going to do an additional 2 hit points every time you heal another creature. I absolutely love this ring. I pretty much use this on every cleric build I have. Just allows you to increase your healing, and over the course of a game, this is an enormous amount. 2 hit points every time you heal another creature for the entirety of the game once you acquire it is very strong. This other ring, when you heal a creature, gain a 1-4 bonus to attack rolls and saving throws for 2 turns. Just a little extra when you use a heal. Typically, you're not in a good situation, so this then protects you a little bit on top of that. The ranged weapon, again, just kind of the best weapon I have access to that nobody else was using in this situation. It possibly does additional damage from the guiding bolt when it hits. It also happens to provide glowing light, does some additional enchantment, and the best feature of this bow and the reason that I have it equipped is just for that celestial haste that it provides as an additional spell as well. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the build. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and have a great day.